Hey there! Thanks for dropping by my channel. Got your seatbelt on for some cool news, handy life hacks, and wild stories? If you love real horror and anything spooky and mystical, you're in the right place. So, let's dive in. It's gonna be intense. Eerie photographs of the Victorian era. Sometimes you look at Victorian photographs and shiver. They're so strange and often monstrous in the literal sense of the word. Photos of dead people made up to look alive, posed and propped up, images of physical disabilities and injuries, collages with severed heads, and ghosts captured using long exposure. Who needed these photographs, and why? Let's leaf through an old album and try to find an explanation for what's on its pages. Standing dead people. Photographs of dead people are a very popular and widely circulated story. You can find many such collections online. Handsome, well-dressed men, women, and, most often, children with their eyes closed, half sitting or lying among living relatives. It's not always possible to guess that the central figure of the composition is already in a better world. Such photos were widespread in Europe and America in the second half of the 19th century. Books of the dead actually existed, and there were even photographers who specialized in capturing the deceased, both individually and alongside still living family members. Children and the elderly were most often photographed. Young dead people were photographed extremely rarely. The girl on the far left in this family photo is dead. The explanation for this tradition, which was common from the 1860s to the early 1910s, is quite simple. In those days, almost no one owned their own camera. Daguerreotypes, and later collodion photography, were complex technologies that required a professional approach. Few private photos were taken, and a photographer's work was prestigious and required high qualifications, which is why it was very well paid. Going to a studio for a family photo was an expensive undertaking, and only wealthy people could afford to invite a photographer into their home. People prepared for the photo session in advance. They did their hair and put on their best clothes. This is why people in 19th century photos seem so dignified and beautiful. They simply posed very carefully. For example, recall the famous photo of Butch Cassidy's A Wild Bunch. The wanted criminals are dressed impeccably, in brand new suits and bowler hats, looking like real dandies and unashamed to be photographed. Why? Because the photographer received a good fee, and the self-respecting Cassidy wanted a handsome photo of his gang. These men robbed banks and trains looking very different. Both girls in this photo are dead. The supports of the stands behind their legs are clearly visible. Because of the high cost of photos and the complexity of the process, many people simply didn't get photographed while alive. This was especially true for children. Child mortality in the 19th century was appalling and yet completely commonplace. Families were large, and on average 2 to 3 out of 10 children died from illnesses in the absence of antibiotics, vaccines, and other modern remedies. The elderly were also rarely photographed during their lifetimes. Photography didn't exist when they were young, and in old age they had other priorities. As a result, people realized they had no family photos only after the death of a loved one. They would then hastily hire a photographer, apply makeup to the body, and pose it in a lifelike position. Often, such photos were the only ones that captured the deceased. People who died between the ages of 20 and 60 were photographed much less often because they usually had time to be photographed while alive. Here, the dead girl's eyes are not painted on. They are held open. Photographers earned good money from this genre. There were many tricks and devices that could make a dead person look alive. For instance, specialized and patented supports were used to give the dead a natural pose, though more often a photo was taken where the deceased imitated a sleeping person. Spacers were inserted into the eyes, and the pupils were turned so the deceased wouldn't look at the camera. Sometimes it was impossible to guess that the person in the photo was dead, except perhaps for a barely noticeable tripod near their feet. Occasionally, photos of famous deceased people were sold as souvenirs. For example, in 1882, after viewing the body of the murdered robber Jesse James, displayed for educational purposes, you could buy a photo of his corpse on the way out. This genre began to decline at the start of the 20th century and had disappeared entirely by the 1920s. Compact personal cameras became widespread, photography became ubiquitous and cheap, and it was hard to find someone who had never been in front of a lens. What remains for us as a memento are countless eerie photographs. However, many of them seem very elegant and interesting, until you realize that the Victorian beauties depicted in them are dead, hidden mothers. Many children didn't have any photographs taken during their lifetime because it was hard to sit a child upright and keep them from fidgeting. Meanwhile, exposure times back then were very long. If a 19th century photographer needed to take a picture of a child alone, without the mother, they used a simple trick. The mother would sit on a chair and be carefully draped, with her hands, face, and legs covered so she looked like a piece of furniture. The child was placed on the mother's lap, where they could behave properly for a while. From the photographer's perspective, it looked as if there was nobody in the photo except the child. However, upon closer inspection, these photographs create an eerie feeling. It's noticeable that a person is sitting motionless under the cover, in the darkness. It seems as if they're about to jump out and devour the unsuspecting innocent child. Victorian Photoshop. On May 23, 1878, a young British photographer, Samuel Key Balbirnie from Brighton, Sussex, UK, placed an advertisement in the Brighton Daily News that later became famous and gave rise to an entire genre of photo manipulation. It read, "Spirit photographs. Ladies and gentlemen will float in the air in the company of tables, chairs, and musical instruments. Headless photographs. Ladies and gentlemen will hold their own heads in their hands. Photographs of dwarfs and giants. It's really funny." Brighton had plenty of photographers, and Balbirnie, who had opened a photo studio, wanted to stand out. He invented a method of photo manipulation based on combining several negatives. In essence, this became the precursor of modern Photoshop. Strangely enough, Balbirnie's idea wasn't a success. Accustomed to traditional photography, Brighton residents were in no hurry to be photographed as headless or flying figures. 2 years later, the photographer closed his studio and went on to serve as an army doctor. But oddly enough, his legacy lived on. The few photographs Balbirnie had taken spread not only through private albums of clients but also through newspapers. As a result, dozens of photographers in England and beyond mastered the simple manipulation of negatives. Headless portraits became a popular genre of photography and remained in fashion until the 1910s. By the way, it's likely that Balbirnie wasn't the inventor of the technology. At least one headless photograph is known to have been taken in 1875, before Balbirnie opened his studio, by another Brighton master, William Henry Wheeler, who ran a photo salon on High Street. However, Wheeler didn't advertise his Photoshop ears openly as Balbirnie and didn't become the founder of the new trend. The exploding mule. The most famous headless photograph doesn't feature a human but a mule, and the mule truly has no head in it. It was taken by British photographer Charles Harper Bennett on June 6, 1881, purely for scientific purposes. Bennett was the son of a Surrey hatter, but in the 1870s decided to start a business selling photographic equipment. In 1878, trying to find a way to shorten exposure time, he realized that the collodion process couldn't be accelerated and that a radically new emulsion composition was needed for instant image fixation. By that time, another photographer, English Dr. Richard Maddox, had already made progress in this area by replacing collodion with gelatin. But he couldn't achieve sufficient fixation speed because the gelatin contained too much liquid. Bennett set out to improve Maddox's method and quickly succeeded. He managed to reduce exposure time from several seconds to 25. 1. of a second. First, Bennett decided to present the technology to the military, specifically the Americans rather than the British, and needed a spectacular yet effective experiment. He chose an unusual way of demonstration. He tied dynamite around the mule's neck, set up a camera on a tripod, and then blew the animal's head off in the presence of U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Henry Abbott and several other military personnel from Willets Point, New York. He managed to take the shot at the moment when the fragments of the head were already flying apart, but the mule's body was still standing before it had time to fall. This demonstrated the speed of photography. A description of the experiment and the results of Bennett's work were published in Scientific American. The technology was successfully implemented. Bennett received a patent and profited from his invention. However, the press heaped criticism on him for cruelty to animals. Since Bennett's father was a hatter, some newspapers played on the phrase "a mad as a hatter" if from Alice in Wonderland. What do you think of these stories? Share your opinion in the comments, like the video if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe. We'll keep surprising you with more stories like these.